The date was August 15th, 1281. Off the coast of Hakata Bay in southern Japan, the horizon had vanished. It was replaced by a forest of 4,000 masts. This was the Grand Armada of the Yuan dynasty, the largest naval force the world had ever seen. 140,000 warriors, including Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans, waited for the order to land. For 20 years, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had been the master of the world. He had crushed the Song dynasty, turned the Silk Road into a Mongol highway, and ruled an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. Now, he had come to finish what he started 7 years earlier. He wanted the islands of Japan. To the Mongols, this was a routine conquest. They possessed the decimal system of organization, massive catapults that fired explosive bombs, and the psychological momentum of an empire that had never truly been stopped. Facing this tidal wave was a tattered line of stone walls and a few thousand warriors who practiced a style of warfare that was 500 years out of date. The samurai. They were individuals, ritualistic, and vastly outnumbered. But as the sun set over the bay, a tiny group of 200 men did something that defied every law of Mongol military logic. They didn't wait for the invasion. They didn't hide behind their walls. They rowed small, fragile boats into the heart of the Mongol fleet to perform a systematic, cold-blooded decapitation of the world's greatest superpower. Today, we go inside the Mongol Invasions of Japan to see how a tiny force of specialized killers used night raids, and the dragon's roar to shatter a fleet of thousands, and why the legend of the Divine Wind hides a much more hard-boiled tactical truth. To understand why Hakata Bay became a graveyard for Mongol ambitions, you have to grasp the two military systems that were about to collide in a fight for survival. The Mongol war machine under Kublai Khan was a masterpiece of mass-coordinated destruction. By 1281, the Mongols had evolved beyond the simple horse archer. They had absorbed the engineering of China and the gunpowder of the East. Their primary weapon on the water was the massive Yuan warship, built in the shipyards of Korea and southern China. These were floating fortresses. To prevent the Japanese from picking off individual ships, the Mongols often chained their vessels together, creating a massive stable platform for their catapults and archers. Their doctrine was built on the phalanx of arrows. They moved in tight, disciplined units. When a samurai stepped forward to challenge a Mongol to a duel, the Mongols didn't bow back. They fired 100 arrows at once. They used the dragon's roar, ceramic bombs, filled with gunpowder and iron scrap that exploded with a sound that terrified the Japanese horses. It was the doctrine of the overwhelming mass. The Japanese system represented the ultimate expression of individual martial perfection. The samurai of the 13th century were not the mass-produced infantry of later eras. They were elite, land-owning warriors whose entire lives were dedicated to the way of the bow and the horse. Their equipment was the finest in the world. Their blades, the katanas and tachi, were forged using a folding process that created a razor-sharp edge capable of cutting through Mongol leather armor like a hot knife through butter. But their tactical thinking was their greatest weakness. Samurai warfare was built on ritual. You were supposed to find a worthy opponent, announce your family lineage, and engage in a one-on-one duel of honor. In the first invasion of 1274, this ritual led to a massacre. The Mongols ignored the introductions and simply mowed the samurai down with group volleys and explosives. By the time of the second invasion in 1281, the samurai had realized that honor meant nothing if your country was a smoking ruin. They had adapted. They had turned from ritualistic duelists into a force of specialized, high-intensity guerrilla killers. The strategic situation in 1281 was a masterclass in defensive engineering. After the first invasion, the Japanese had spent 7 years building a massive stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay. It was 2 meters high and ran for 20 kilometers. This wall changed the physics of the battle. It meant the Mongols could not use their cavalry. They were forced to stay on their ships, anchored in the bay, while they waited for their 2 main fleets to coordinate an attack. This created a bottleneck. 4,000 ships were packed into a narrow body of water, their movement restricted by the coastline and their own chains. Kublai Khan's strength, his massive numbers, was now his greatest vulnerability. The fleet was a giant, slow-moving target. That is when the Japanese triggered their secret weapon, the kusune boats. These were small, extremely fast-rowing vessels, barely large enough for 15 or 20 men. They were low to the water and almost invisible in the dark. While the Mongol commanders sat on their massive warships, confident in their size, the samurai were preparing for a series of high-speed, high-risk night raids. The plan was not to sink the fleet. The plan was to behead it. The most legendary of these raids was led by a samurai named Ko no Mi Chi Ari. He had watched the Mongol fleet from the shore for weeks. He saw that the Mongols were overconfident. They believed the Japanese were too afraid to leave the protection of their stone walls. Michi, Ari, and a group of 200 elite warriors took 2 small boats out into the bay in the middle of the night. To the Mongol sentries, these tiny boats looked like drifting debris or small fishing vessels. The samurai even lowered the masts of their boats to make them look like logs. As they closed the distance to a massive Mongol flagship, the sentries finally realized what was happening. They began to rain down arrows, but the samurai were already too close. The boats pulled alongside the towering hull of the Yuan ship. The samurai used the lowered masts as makeshift ladders and scaling poles. They didn't climb with shields, they climbed with katanas in their teeth. Within seconds, the 200 warriors were over the rail and on the deck. What followed was a masterclass in close-quarters butchery. The Mongol warriors on deck were used to fighting in formations with spears and bows. In the cramped, dark spaces of a ship's deck, they were no match for the samurai. The Japanese moved like ghosts, their blades carving through the Mongol ranks. Michia Ri's goal was the command center. He found the high-ranking Mongol officer in charge of the vessel. In a few seconds of blur-like speed, the officer was cut down and his head was taken. This was the decapitation strike. Without their officers, the decimal system of the Mongols collapsed into chaos. The samurai didn't stop there. They threw torches into the hold, setting the pitch-covered wood on fire. Then, before the surrounding Mongol ships could react, the samurai jumped back into their boats and vanished into the darkness. These raids happened every night for weeks. The psychological impact on the Mongol fleet was devastating. The world's greatest army was being picked apart by men they couldn't see. The Mongol soldiers couldn't sleep. They lived in a state of permanent terror, waiting for a blade to emerge from the dark. They began to chain their ships even tighter together for protection, but this only made the fire spread faster when a ship was hit. The morale of the Yuan armada began to disintegrate. The commanders were arguing. The Chinese and Korean sailors who were conscripted and didn't want to be there were on the verge of mutiny. The unstoppable force was paralyzed by 200 men in small boats. The strategic situation reached its breaking point in late August. The Mongols were exhausted, their leadership was fractured, and they were trapped in the bay. That's when nature intervened. A massive typhoon, which the Japanese would later call the Kamikaze, or divine wind, swept into the bay. In an open ocean, the Mongol fleet might have survived, but because they were chained together and trapped against a lee shore, the storm was a death sentence. The massive warships smashed into each other like glass. The chains that were supposed to protect them became anchors that dragged them to the bottom. Thousands of men drowned in the churning water. But here is the hard truth that history often forgets. The divine wind didn't win the war alone. The wind only finished what the samurai had started. If the samurai had not built the wall, the Mongols would have landed and conquered the islands weeks before the storm arrived. If the samurai had not conducted the night raids, the Mongol fleet would have been organized and capable of sailing out to sea to ride out the typhoon. The divine wind was the final blow, but the tactical genius of the Japanese defense was what put the Mongols in the path of the storm. The aftermath of the 1281 invasion was the greatest disaster in the history of the Mongol Empire. Of the 140,000 men who sailed for Japan, only a few thousand returned to China. The prestige of Kublai Khan was shattered. The invincible Mongol was a myth. The Japanese had proven that a specialized high-intensity defense could defeat a global superpower if you could nullify their numbers and strike at their psychological center. The strategic implications rippled across Asia. The Yuan dynasty never attempted a third invasion. The cost had been too high, and the fear of the island of the gods was too deep. For Japan, the victory created a national identity that would last for 700 years. They believed they were protected by the gods. But the real protection had come from the blood and steel of the samurai, who were willing to change their way of life to save their country. What makes the story of the Mongol invasions different from any other conflict is the evolution of the warrior. It was the moment the samurai stopped being a ritualistic performer and became a modern soldier. They identified that the Mongol strength, their rigid organization, could be defeated by the chaos of the night. They used the kusune, boats, as a force multiplier, turning a tiny group of men into a strategic threat. They used the geography of Hakata Bay to turn a massive fleet into a target. The legacy of the divine wind is a testament to the power of the defensive offensive. It serves as a reminder that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is the ability to adapt. The Mongols were the masters of the world because they had adapted to every enemy from China to Persia. But in the waters of Japan, they met an enemy that out-adapted them. The samurai took the Mongols' own secret trick, the use of shock and terror, and turned it against them. The 200 samurai who rode into the dark were the pioneers of special operations. They proved that a small group of highly trained, highly motivated individuals can achieve results that an army of thousands cannot. They were the thunder before the storm. They were the blades in the night that prepared the way for the wind. It was the day individual martial perfection and desperate tactical innovation turned a global conquest into a legendary failure. It was the day the world's largest fleet was beheaded by a few small boats and a mountain of courage. If you want to see how this victory influenced the rise of the Japanese feudal system and the eventual era of the warring states, watch this next video. Subscribe for more battles where brilliant strategy and the divine wind of genius changed the course of history.